I'd like to welcome you to our panel presented by our title sponsor, American Wind Energy Association. And to host the panel is AWEA CEO Tom Kiernan. Tom, take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to welcome everybody to the Clean Energy Future panel. We actually have an outstanding set of panelists here, some experts, some leaders in clean energy and in Iowa. And in just a minute, we're going to ask them to introduce themselves. What I did want to do first, though, is talk about how extraordinarily relevant and important this topic is actually today, given obviously, yes, the day before the caucus, but also given the leadership of Iowa on clean energy. It's a coming together, clean energy, climate change, obviously a key topic for discussion. The candidates have been campaigning throughout the state, talking about their climate plans. So Iowa is a leader in the presidential process and a leader in clean energy. In fact, Iowa launched the clean energy revolution back in 1983. So let me give you a few examples of the importance of clean energy here in Iowa, and then we're going to jump right into the panel. So a couple of key topics, as I mentioned, Iowa launched the revolution in 1983 with the first state to have a renewable portfolio standard, saying, hey, we want to have renewable energy here in the state. Since 1983, for virtually all of those years to now, Iowa was the #1 state in the country for the percentage of wind energy in Iowa. It's currently at 34% of all the electricity in Iowa is wind energy. It'll soon be 40% at the end of this year. So Iowa's been the leader of wind energy. As a result of that, it's also been a leader in jobs. Wind energy has created 10,000 jobs here in Iowa, and that's growing. Wind energy is, the wind turbine technician is the fastest or second fastest growing profession of the last 3 years, and Iowa is getting the benefit of that growth. Another way that Iowa is a leader, because Iowa has all this wind energy, it is attracting new businesses. Companies like Apple and Microsoft and Facebook and Google are coming to Iowa because clean energy, wind energy is available. Obviously, because of the wind energy, Iowa's a leader in reducing carbon. Throughout the entire country, wind energy is the equivalent of reducing 43 million cars off the road, taking 43 million cars off the road. So Iowa's a leader in reducing their carbon emissions. Costs, wind energy is the cheapest source of new electricity, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. And lastly, one of the things I love about wind energy, it's bipartisan. A poll was just done of the American public, and 85% of Americans said they want more wind energy. And of that, it was 79% of Republicans wanting more wind energy, and it was 89 or so Democrat. Point being, Republicans, Democrats, Independents all love wind energy. And the last factoid I appreciated, every president since George Herbert Walker Bush, Republican, Democrat, has either extended or expanded the major tax support. All sources of energy have tax support, and as does wind. And we've had Republican and Democrats as president championing wind energy. So that gives you a little bit of rationale for why this is so important today to be here the day before the caucus to talk about clean energy, because it's so important here in Iowa. So with that, as a stage setting, if I can ask the panel, Mike, do you want to lead off, say a word about yourself and MidAmerican?
Sure. My name is Mike Fehr. I'm Vice President, Resource Development for MidAmerican Energy Company. My department is responsible for all the development and construction of new wind projects that MidAmerican builds. We currently own approximately 6.3 gigawatts of wind energy here in Iowa, and we have some of the lowest rates in the nation, due in part to our wind fleet.
I'm Justin Foss, and I represent Alliant Energy, which has operations in Iowa as well as in Wisconsin. We're building about 1,000 megawatts of wind right now. We're halfway through that build out. We started last year, and we should be done by the end of this year.
Thanks for having me out here, Tom. And thanks to AWEA for sponsoring this important panel and this get-together here in this beautiful facility. My name is Charles Hernick, and I'm with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. We're a right-of-center, all-of-the-above, market-oriented clean energy organization. And so we are loving wind power because of the economics. And we'll get into some of those details. But it's an exciting time, not just to be in Iowa, but to be in the field.
We're going to have a lot of quotes coming out of this, but we're loving wind energy. That's one of the ones we're going to hang on to. Kerry?
Good afternoon. I'm Kerry Johansen. I'm the Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. And the Iowa Environmental Council is a statewide umbrella nonprofit of businesses and organizations that are interested in moving clean water and clean energy forward. Our overall goal for our energy program is to hit 100% renewable energy in the state of Iowa.
Gotta love that goal. Dusty?
Good afternoon. My name is Dusky Terry. I'm president of ITC Midwest. I'm a lifelong Iowan. I've spent the first 10 years of my career working in public policy, including on energy issues, in the last 12 years in the industry. And at ITC, we own electric transmission lines, about 6,700 miles of lines, mostly in Iowa, a little bit in southern Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri. And really, I'm here today because modernizing our power grid is really key to unlocking and unleashing the full potential of wind energy. And so we want to be a part of that future and that solution.
Great. Thank you very much, Dusty. Let's open it up, and I want all the panelists to jump in if you're comfortable, but share with us, so why in Iowa? Why has wind been so successful? I mean, you started talking about kind of the goals and the success, but I'd love to hear from each of your perspectives, why is wind so successful here in Iowa?
I could go on for a while about this, but I think one thing is it's a great complement to agriculture. A wind turbine requires about a half acre being converted from farmland to wind energy production. It's a very good use of the land. It's a great complement. As you mentioned, it's bipartisan. There have been some, the regulatory treatment from a utility perspective. Iowa has something called advanced rate making that lets a utility determine things like what ROE they'll earn on a project before they build it instead of waiting till afterwards. And so I would say those are some of the things that have really helped us be able to move forward with as much wind energy as we have.
And I'll jump in on that. I think that one of the major things driving wind power are the economics. The time has never been better to invest in wind power. And since 2009, we've seen the prices drop 55% for a turbine. That's a pretty big deal. If you walk into a store and suddenly things are 55% off what they were a little bit ago, you get excited. And so the economics are a major thing. But I think to piggyback on what was just said, wind pays real people. All of my life, I've walked into the bathroom to brush my teeth in the morning. You turn on the lights, and you don't really think about the electricity. But here in Iowa, it's a tangible benefit to real people, real farmers, who in some cases have been able to make valuable life changes. And the last time I was here just a couple of months ago, talking to a farmer who was able to diversify his income stream beyond corn and harvest the wind. And he had 3 daughters, and over the course of the first couple years was able to save up enough to put daughter 1 through college, and was excited to try to put more wind turbines on his land for daughters 2 and 3. And that's a pretty big deal. So it's really impactful for the actual humans that are out there trying to make a living off the land.
Wonderful story. Do others agree with the economic, kind of the fundamental economic case for wind energy? Does that make sense? Justin from Alliant?
Exactly. I think the big thing when you think about it is not only the cost of the turbine, as you said, which has dropped, the cost of the maintenance, which has dropped, because we've perfected how to maintain these turbines over the course of their life. But also, when you think about it in the other sense of how else are you going to get electricity? Traditionally, it's been from coal and from gas. And for both of those situations, not only do you need the generator itself, but you need the fuel to make the generator run. And that's a cost that customers pay. And when you have more renewable energy, and especially wind, where especially in Northwest Iowa, we've got a lot of it, there's no cost for that fuel. So not only is the cost for the generator down, but the cost for the fuel is gone, and that's an ongoing cost that goes into the future.
Yeah. Kerry, do you want to jump in? Why do you all support wind energy? Is it this cost reason or other reasons?
Well, certainly, as an environmental organization, we want to see a transition away from fossil fuels, which have all kinds of unintended consequences, carbon pollution, air quality issues, water quality threats, into a clean energy economy that's fueled 100% by renewable energy. At the same time, the economics do matter because energy prices are important to people. It's a fundamental part of what people have to pay to, live and survive and have a sustainable life. And so we think the cost issue is really important. And I think it's really interesting that Iowa, because we were an early leader, and to point back to what was mentioned earlier, Senator Grassley's support for the wind production tax credit, which really was part of helped launch the industry. And the work we did in Iowa was part of the reason some of these soft costs have come down, part of the reason why we know how to maintain turbines and why there's enough construction equipment, and getting it to scale was something partially that happened here in Iowa, which is a really cool legacy to have.
Dusty.
Yeah, I think there's two things that have really driven the success. Iowa's got a great story to tell when it comes to wind energy, and it starts with leadership. And it's been mentioned here already, but leadership amongst our elected officials to seize the opportunity to embrace a new technology and bring it to Iowa. And the combination with the ag land that's available, the wind resource that's available here, and then the thing that's really sustained it and helped it take off are the economics. And we saw a significant change in 2016 in this state, where for the first time, many of our large coal plants were brought offline in the spring of 2016 for economics. And at the time, we didn't know what was causing that. It was something that we hadn't seen before because coal had been kind of that low-cost baseload source of generation. But it was two things that were really driving that change. One was the build out of wind had kind of reached a critical mass across the state, that it was now at that point driving the profile of generation in the state. And the other thing was natural gas dropping to $3 and below. And so that has fundamentally changed the economics of energy in this state, and it's benefited every rate-paying customer in Iowa because we're at the wholesale energy level, we're buying energy out of that market much cheaper than we did before. And so wind has been a key driver in that and continues to fuel that going forward.
Outstanding. Charles, you shared a story about one farmer able to put his 3 daughters or working towards 3 daughters through college. Other examples or other stories of the benefits of wind energy that you're seeing in communities, Mike?
Yeah, that kind of just sparked something that I heard at one of our local community events where we were working with some of the landowners. Actually, maybe the opposite end of the spectrum, but elder care. So there are a lot of communities in Iowa where the average age is creeping up, and the ability to have a better elder care for the parents is something that has come up for us before too.
And we've got now 3 wind farms operating in Franklin County in the middle of the state, just north of here in Des Moines. And the county supervisors will tell you that for our first 2 wind farms, which have now been operating for about a decade, that they've got some of the best roads in the state. And you ask them, why are your roads so good? And they'll say, because we've had the money to put into them. And we've not had to raise the taxes for our residents like what the other counties have had to do. And one of the county supervisors has said, this is like, our wind farms are like our big factory. We're a small rural county, and he'll say, we are not going to get these ginormous factories here. But we've got your wind farm, which is chugging and creating that taxable revenue for us, that tax base for us that's helping us make investments in the county that we wouldn't have the opportunity to do otherwise.
That's great. And this is leading the witness, I'll confess up front, but I will say, and you're telling me these kind of community benefits and at the same time, low cost electricity?
It's a good deal. And to build off of that, it's not just about the supply, that it's something that communities want. It's what people nationwide want. People want renewable power. People want clean energy. Today is Super Bowl Sunday. Last year, during the Super Bowl, I was watching and pleasantly surprised to see a Budweiser ad that focused on their commitment to brewing beer with 100% wind power. That's a big deal. As a Budweiser drinker, I really support that action. But it just goes to show you where the average American is in terms of their interests. And it's not just people who are buying beer. It's some of the biggest companies in the world, ExxonMobil, Walmart, that are making big, direct corporate expenditures to buy clean energy, both for the marketing purposes and for levelizing their costs in the long term.
Others want to jump in on it? Mike, did you have? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I just I had a couple of other thoughts too. I think in rural Iowa, another thing that really has been benefited are the schools. A lot of the tax money that's collected goes to schools. We paid over $26 million in 2019 to property taxes in rural Iowa. We paid another over $29 million to landowners in rural Iowa in some of those same areas. So, of course, for us, that's kind of a win-win. We're able to take this money instead of sending it out of state to buy fuel. We're pouring it right back into making the local economy strong in the areas that we serve. The stronger those areas are, the better that is for us too.
I would just echo how important this is to rural Iowa. In the last 12 years, ITC has interconnected 31 wind farms, which represents about 3,500 megawatts of generating capacity and an economic impact of over $4 billion. And that's significant to a lot of rural counties in this state that really need that boost to regain the prosperity that we all want.
I'm going to jump in as well as with rural Iowa. This is bringing those jobs, those sustained jobs to rural Iowa. Definitely throughout construction and development, you've got an influx of jobs coming to those areas, 300, 400, 500, 1,000 workers, at their peak, depending on the size of the farm, where all the available rental units, some that have been sitting vacant for years, are now used and busy, and the restaurants are busy, and they are busy for the entire construction time. That's a great thing for everybody. But then going forward, where the wind techs are there, you are bringing high-paying jobs to very rural communities that are going to be there for a long time, and that's a big deal.
And to add on to that a little bit, several of our community colleges here in Iowa have seen the need to fill this workforce gap and have renewable technician programs that they'll tell you about all the time about how successful these programs are, and folks can go in for a 2-year degree or a certificate after they have a 2-year degree and come out making $60,000 to $80,000 a year, which there just aren't many jobs in rural areas. If that's the kind of lifestyle you want to have and where you like to live, which so many people do, you can make good money doing this job.
And it's not a fleeting job either. I think that's the really important thing to consider. For the past decade, the second fastest growing job in the United States has been the wind technician.
Yep.
Number one is the solar guy, but wind is right there for number two. And over the course of the next decade, those are the top 2 jobs that are projected for growth for the next decade. So if you want job stability, a good paycheck, mobility, because that's the other thing too, is that we're seeing wind crop up in every part of the country. I come from out east where they're looking to build offshore wind turbines. Very different kind of construction than we're seeing here in the Midwest, but still very tangible. And a lot of those skills are transferable, and they offer Americans an opportunity to move up in a way that they haven't been able to before.
Yep. Let me jump in now with a provocative question. I hear often, and would love to hear your all's response. Yeah, but wind is intermittent. You can't count on it. The wind doesn't blow all the time. Your reaction to that? I mean, how are the two of you and others putting this much wind on the grid since it's intermittent? Your thoughts?
This may be a little bit of an oversimplification, but when I get this question in a meeting of people that aren't from the industry, I try to liken it to a sailboat that has a diesel engine. So why pay for diesel, right? You can get this low cost source of power a lot of the time if you live in Iowa or other places that have a great wind resource most of the time. But we do need other sources of generation to back it up. But again, just because you need some backup generation at this time, and I think a lot of technologies are coming along to help replace that with renewable sources. But just because you need that right now doesn't mean you shouldn't save money by using this much lower cost source of energy when it's available.
And it's not just saving money, because that's a big piece too. It's saving emissions, because when the winds are blowing and our turbines are running, we're not running our fossil fueled plants nearly like what we would have otherwise. So we are able to reduce our water usage, reduce our emissions of SOx, NOx, CO2, all of those other pieces. So not only are we getting the no fuel cost that benefits our customers, we're getting the no emissions We're going to get the no water usage like other alternatives. And so it's having that balanced mix of how it works. And I think part of it, Mike, what we see is how the power grid works today has changed drastically over the last 10 years, especially over the last 20 and 30 years. And so when we get asked that question, it's from a lot of folks who remember 30 years ago when it was coal plants running all the time, 100%. They'd run the same at day and they'd run the same at night. And it's just not like that anymore. The power grid has changed drastically. A lot of that's due to the fact of combined cycle natural gas, which is now able to respond quickly to the changes in the wind, ramp up and down in a matter of minutes as opposed to a matter of days, where you used to see with the older technology. And so instead of having the diesel engine that's running there 24/7, 100%, you've got these various sources that are going to come up and come down depending on what conditions you've got. And in Iowa, we've got a lot of wind. And so it just makes sense to use that fuel that you've got coming to your state right there for free.
Dusty.
And there is, obviously, there is no single perfect source of generation when it comes to electricity. If there was, every utility would be using it. And as you mentioned, wind, the knock on that is it's intermittent. Under the old utility model where it was serve your load, that was hard to compete because you needed some base load, you need some peaking, and just it's hard to rely on when the wind's going to blow. With the creation of the energy markets and the MISO market in particular, it balances out. And so the key then is balance and diversity of generation sources. And wind is a great complement to solar. And when you throw natural gas in there that's quick start, can ramp up and down very quickly to kind of fill in those valleys. You've got a pretty reliable source of generation long term. And so it's a function of the changing energy markets that's really allowed a role for wind going forward.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Things are changing very quickly in this space all the time, as I'm sure everyone here would attest to. And, the next thing that folks are really taking a look at is storage. And as the cost of storage comes down, I think that's going to be a big piece of how we balance load across these very large footprints going forward. I think the other big piece of this is transmission and the need for a really robust transmission system so that even when the wind isn't blowing in Iowa, maybe it's blowing in Minnesota, maybe it's blowing in Wisconsin, maybe it's blowing, maybe the sun is shining brightly down in Louisiana and we can, ship power up from there. So that really robust transmission system, and that, that's something that I think Iowa and the MISO region also, it points to the success that we've had because we have been able to build out good transmission. Now we're at the point of maybe needing to do that again and make another investment in transmission. So that's something we'd like to see happen.
Let's stick on that point of transmission. Other reaction? Dusty, I imagine you have a thought.
I'd love to jump in here. Clearly, the transmission system has allowed what we've seen from the wind energy industry so far, but more must be done. And I point to a few situations. Number one, NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, came out with their long-term reliability assessment at the end of last year. They identified that the transmission investment has not kept pace with that of renewable energy. And going forward, in order to ensure reliability of the grid, we need additional investment really in those kind of interregional transmission systems and overlays. Last week we had 4 former FERC commissioner chairs come out and they were celebrating 2 decades of the RTOs, but they identified we need federal direction on transmission. The investment hasn't been there. The development of the transmission grid has not kept pace with the need driven by renewable energy. The advocacy group WIRES just did a study. They affirmed the same thing that I just mentioned. And clearly, if you look at the MISO generation interconnection queue, there's a backlog of renewable energy projects that are waiting to come online. There's just not the transmission capacity available to do it. So in order to fully realize the potential of wind energy, we must invest in that transmission system.
Let me just add, the cost of transmission is built into the price of the wind energy. Is that correct? Or how is that? Or is the transmission additive, and we need to talk about that?
What you're seeing is a need to invest more in the transmission system, and I get nobody wants to spend more for the same level of electricity, but in order to realize the benefits of that low cost generation from wind energy, we got to invest in that transmission system, and the net impact to the ratepayer is a lower electricity cost as a result.
That's great. All you got, Mike first.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Then
so when we build a wind project, one of the costs of the project is something called interconnection upgrades, which we may build a project in Iowa and it may result in a transmission line being added or a substation being upgraded in Michigan. So it is part of the cost of the wind energy that we build, and I agree completely that we really would benefit from more transmission. MISO did something called Multivalue Project Portfolio, where they actually approved transmission based on the economic benefits that the transmission would bring. So it wasn't so much as relieving congestion or reliability. It was more about the economics, and it was a tremendous success. The benefit to cost ratio is very high, and as someone who likes a good deal, it sure seems to me like there'd be a benefit in doing more of that kind of thing.
Good. Kerry, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, part of what I was going to say is that you could do these projects piecemeal, and you get your interconnection upgrades, and you pay for these things one at a time as they come along. But that's not the efficient way to do it. These multi-value projects really help you take a look at, on a large scale, how can we more efficiently relieve some of these issues and do it at a lower cost to customers.
And it does highlight a real policy need. I'm a big champion of markets and talked about both supply and demand, but there is something that the federal government can and should do to provide strategic planning and a nationwide view that really only the federal government can do to identify where there might be good rights of way and where there might be opportunities to do more than one thing at the same time as it relates to transportation and transmission infrastructure updates. But the other part of it too is simplifying regulations. Transmission lines, the permitting sometimes takes over 7 years for the permitting to complete a project. And when I talk to folks, and there's a great urgency about dealing with climate change and bringing on 100% renewable power soon, 7 years per permit seems like an awful long time, and so there's got to be a way to reduce that timeline.
I want to get to policy in a minute, but let me come back. Kerry, you talked briefly about storage. Would love to hear thoughts. I mean, what's the deal with storage? Why is it important? Is it really expensive? You hear batteries are expensive, but thoughts on where storage is as part of this overall movement towards renewables?
So we just actually installed a new battery in the middle of a cornfield in southwest Iowa, because we had a group of customers down there that have got solar panels on top of their farm outbuildings, and it is so much that it was affecting our voltage on that circuit. And so our options were either completely rebuild the circuit at a large cost, tell the customers to curtail their energy, or to install a battery now to help levelize voltage. And so now we are using a new Tesla battery. Right, we're using this new battery in the middle of a cornfield to help regulate voltage, to help get as much of that solar energy as those customers can generate, get it on the grid, get that clean, renewable energy on there, and to make sure that the energy grid continues to be reliable for all the other customers.
Other thoughts on storage?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that storage will be kind of a game changer for the grid, but I don't think it's there yet. From a cost perspective, and we put in a battery, a 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hour battery in Iowa, which may not sound like a lot, but it's for a battery that's in the use it's in, it's pretty big for this part of. I think it's the biggest one in Iowa anyway, but you really need to have some kind of a problem right now. Batteries are really robust technologies for solving a lot of different kinds of problems. And in California, you hear about the duck curve, where they have really low prices, maybe even negative prices during the high solar production, and then it's a really high price right when the sun starts to go down. We don't really have anything like that. We don't have the kind of reliability issues, at least not on a large scale that Justin just described. So, the maturity curve for batteries shows the price is expected to continue to decline, and it's going to get there, but. Right now, I don't think it's quite there, and I think a battery really it's a net load. So if you're trying to use it as a as a renewable resource, you really concentrate the emissions that go into it. So if you're not charging it with a renewable source, then it's not really a renewable source or means of using energy. But I think as the costs come down, it'll be something that can be paired with renewable generation to kind of offset the need to address the intermittency issue.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it holds great potential. Battery storage does. From what I've seen in terms of costs, they have come down considerably. I think we're still probably 3 to 5 years out before we'll see really commercial application of battery storage here in Iowa. It does help kind of balance out that wind and solar intermittency. There's also, a transmission application for batteries. I mean, you can really use them across the entire span of the industry. It's really a matter of pricing and application and kind of when those intersect that it makes sense to deploy them. And like I said, I think we're 3 to 5 years out.
Helpful. I want to let the audience know we're going to come to audience questions in a few minutes, so think about any questions you might have. But let me right now come back. Charles, you started talking policy and would love people's thoughts. Obviously, the presidential candidates are out there talking policies, their different plans and initiatives. If you were advising one of the candidates to say, hey, if you want to advance renewable energy, here's the policy that I would recommend you endorse. Any thoughts on what policies these candidates should be espousing to enhance wind and solar and renewable?
I'd start with a general comment that I think at the federal level, we would like to see a clear climate policy and a clear energy policy and direction. We've gotten a lot of mixed signals over the last several years coming out of Washington, D.C. FERC has had, kind of a revolving door of commissioners, and that's going to continue. We have another commissioner that's going to roll off this summer. Some consistency, a clear vision, a clear direction on where we need to go on energy policy at the federal level, I think would certainly help address a lot of the regional issues and state-by-state issues. And I think Iowa really is a model for the country on where we can go. We've embraced renewable energy, we've embraced wind energy, and we've done it in a cost-effective way to the benefit of our ratepayers.
Other thoughts? What policies? Mike?
I think it really should kind of sell itself. I don't understand why. Okay. If you're in favor of something that has, the economics are very compelling, it's a domestic source of energy, it's emission-free. I think it's 6 months is the time period to repay the carbon footprint of creating a wind turbine. Really across the political spectrum, there's just a lot of benefits to wind energy.
Kerri, I want to put you on the spot. Policies from an environmental perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to go off of what Dusky said about just the really critical need for there to be a serious federal policy direction on energy in the direction of defossilization and deployment of renewable energy. Right now, what we have is a patchwork, basically, of some states that have decided to go that direction, some haven't, and yet we're faced with an integrated grid, integrated in some places, not in others, where there should be more connections. We are being somewhat hamstrung in the ability to invest in these large projects for that reason, or decide, what's the most efficient and effective way to move forward in this direction. And so I think that one of the most important things is to just get everyone paddling in the same direction, because it's going to take, using the best resources in each state or each region in all 50 states and connecting folks in order to get to a place where we're making significant progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
One of the biggest stumbling blocks for that large regional transmission investment is cost allocation. And so one of the things that the 4 former FERC commissioner chairs recommended last week was federal legislation that directed to FERC to address that issue so that we can
say where the cost allocation being the allocation of the cost of a transmission line?
Correct. When you have a large transmission line that spans multiple regions, how do you allocate those costs fairly? And generally, you want to allocate the cost based on who's receiving the benefits, but there's always details that make that complicated, and that really needs to be addressed in order to invest in the power grid that is needed to fully utilize the potential of wind energy.
Charles, you want to jump in on policy?
Yeah, I think that to piggyback on what others have said, there's no substitute for vision when it comes to where we can be in the clean energy space. And I think that means setting emissions targets in the long term and allowing businesses and citizens to do their job and find each other in the marketplace. What the federal government can do is help simplify that, improve transmission, decrease permitting times, provide stable price signals to the market. Right now, folks deal with tax credits, and we don't want to get into the weeds of that kind of stuff in this discussion, but a long-term price signal will help investors make those types of planning decisions that they need to. We don't need to overdo it. We're headed in the right direction. Wind is growing exponentially, and we can see that continue to take off through very tailored and custom approaches, not a heavy hand by the federal government.
Got it. Let me open up to the audience. Are there any questions that you're dying to ask? I think there may be a microphone. Mac may have one. Any questions from folks out there? All right, not at the moment then. We'll keep the discussion up here. Let's pursue a bit. You all talked about consistency and a clear vision. Add a little more granularity. I mean, there are proposals out there for a carbon tax. There are some that are saying a clean energy standard at the federal level. You, to some extent, we're leading that, or a cap and trade. What do you think of these different climate proposals? Obviously, there's the Green New Deal some are talking about, but any preferences to how the country at the national level should address climate?
I'll speak generally. I think businesses like consistency and predictability. It's very hard to make decisions about your business when the rules of the game are changing and you don't know what the future holds or what the rules may be down the road. And so, again, I'd call for that clear policy, that clear vision, and clear direction. And I think we can adapt to whatever those rules are as long as they're not constantly changing. And even in some cases, they're changing retroactively and going back and changing policies that apply, years ago. And it just makes it very difficult to operate a business and make decisions.
When we make investments in infrastructure, we're not looking for to make that investment and to be done with it in 5 years. We're looking generations out, 40 years out. Our newest wind turbines, depreciation life, 40 years. So it makes it very difficult to justify an investment today if we know that the underlying factors for that investment are going to change drastically in 4 years. Because we're looking in that long term. So as the group has said, consistency is really what's most important for us. And you are going to see some utilities and some other companies get to that milestone differently. Right now, we're all pushing to that clean energy future. I think it's also important to recognize that today, we're also pushing for a balanced portfolio of generation, understanding today's needs and today's technology. That's going to change drastically in the years ahead as technology changes. I've heard from others who've been at the company for a long time that if they would have stood up 20 years ago and said, in 20 years we're going to power the energy grid off of wind and gas and solar, you would have been laughed out of the room because the technology was not there. It's there. And so now we think, what does 20 years out from today look like? And how are things going to change? And so we're excited for kind of where that technology is going to lead us. And so we need policy that helps create new technology, that helps integrate those those new technologies, that helps us be nimble and agile in adopting those technologies, but also helps set that stage so that when we're looking out, we don't see giant curves that are going to completely erode foundations for decisions.
Kerry?
Yeah, I was just going to add, the Iowa Environmental Council primarily works at the state level on state policy, but when I think about federal policy, some of the things that would be really important to us is making sure that a lot of people have the opportunity to participate in clean energy future. So, whether it's through energy efficiency, making sure people can save money on their energy bills by using less energy in their homes, whether it's access to being able to have your own solar panels or access to electric vehicles for people of all income levels. I think that those are elements that, and maybe those are policies that happen more at the state level as the federal government setting the larger vision and framework. Those are the kinds of details details that we like to get into. But I think, for any federal framework, we would want to make sure that there's room for that, for how do the people in the states and how do the people in their communities participate.
And that's a critical point. Tom, you started the conversation with Iowa policy innovation, a renewable portfolio standard, and we need to not forget the power of states to lead. And I think that is something that is tricky when you get into a presidential election, and that kind of conversation is folks want a simple federal solution, and the truth is there are 50 states. And when it comes to energy policy, states have a lot of autonomy and authority that's existed for well over 100 years. So a federal policy that tips over the apple cart is not something that my organization favors. We don't favor a carbon tax because there's no state precedent for it. Some states have been capping and trading, and it's working. And in the energy sector writ large, market forces have been driving down emissions to the point where it's not the power sector that's the problem anymore, it's transportation, heavy industry. And so we need to better understand where those successes are and have the federal government double down on the areas where they have been working, providing that long-term stable funding for innovation. Over the past 3 years, I should say, funding for Department of Energy innovation programs has gone up 25%. That's a good thing. So we're seeing a strong growth trajectory there to help plant the seeds for those types of future technologies that will be a critical part of the recipe in years to come.
Great. You alluded to, and Dusty and Mike and others have talked about a vision, kind of a goal. Any thoughts on what vision you have? Some say, hey, we should be 100% renewables. Do you have that view, or how do you think about a goal, whether for your company or for where the country should be heading? Do you have a target? Do you have a goal in mind for renewables or wind energy? How do you think about that? Mike?
Yeah, at MidAmerican, we have a goal, and we expect to get there in 2021 of generating as much renewable energy each year as our customers use. So it's a percentage that is certified by the Iowa Utilities Board, our local regulator. And right now we're at over 60%. We expect to see a pretty big jump this year based on, we installed over 1,000 megawatts last year. And we expect to be there in calendar year 2021.
Outstanding. Other thoughts on the goals, Justin or others?
Our goal really is that clean energy future. And how we get there, I think, is something that we're open to, seeing where technology takes us. But what we know is that we're actively reducing emissions and reducing our carbon footprint out there. We've put out our long-term goals, such as retiring all of our owned coal by 2050, if not sooner. And reducing water usage. And so it's looking at our environmental footprint and really pulling that down as we continue to move forward and look and adopt and innovate with all this new technology that's coming forward.
So ITC Midwest is an independent transmission provider. We are open and supportive of all sources of generation. We don't discriminate. So it's really not for us to say what that goal should be. But I can tell you that we do hear from our customers a demand for renewable energy, clean, reliable, renewable energy. And we're seeing it from large industrial customers, residential customers. There is a demand there for that. And so our job really is to make sure that there's a transmission system that allows that energy, when it's generated at those wind farms, to be delivered to where it's needed.
Kerry?
There have been a lot of analyses that have been done. I know there was a group called the Midwest Power Sector Collaborative that looked at the MISO market and what would be possible within the MISO market in terms of decarbonization, and found that we could get to about 80% deep decarbonization with current technologies and in a cost-effective way. And so looking at that 80%, and then, there are a lot of unknowns. It's been mentioned here before. Technology is changing. We do need investments in new kinds of technology and to figure out how do we get to that last 20% in a way that is cost effective for customers, because that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Great. Earlier, I can't remember who brought up electric vehicles, and would love to hear your thoughts. We've got wind energy, solar, storage to degree. What's your vision on electric vehicles, so to speak, and how does that fit into this discussion of renewables? So thoughts on EVs and their role in all of this. Kerry?
Well, from a policy perspective, I think the direction we see things going is that we want to see fossil uses electrified, whether it's in buildings or transportation, and then to clean up the electric sector as much as possible from a climate change standpoint. That does mean we are going to need even more electricity than we already need right now, and so there's a big path ahead of us. But I think those two items, and especially vehicle transportation, is a really exciting opportunity, and we want to see that take shape.
Yeah, we'd love to see that take shape too. It's another way to address the intermittency issue to some extent, in that you can have an electric vehicle and you can set it to charge at a time when, typically it would be a windier time, in the evening, or not right on top of when the rest of the electric system is at or near peak load.
And we're also just seeing the advantages of the other advantages of electric vehicles, right? So we've got rebates now, and we're working with customers who want to electrify when their trucks are sitting there, their refrigeration trucks are sitting there idling, maybe in a warehouse lot. The refrigerator unit has to keep running that whole time, and usually that's running on gasoline, which is a lot of emissions. And so we're working with companies to figure out how can we electrify that so that while it's sitting there, it's not sitting there running on gasoline. It's running on electricity that, depending on the resources, is more renewable than ever before. So the emissions profile is a lot lower. We're seeing from companies that are electrifying their forklifts inside their buildings. And not only is it a lower cost for them, but also the air quality inside the building drastically changes because they're not creating emissions inside the buildings. And now the building is using less energy because it doesn't have to run the HVAC like it did before to be able to vent out the emissions from the forklifts. So there's a whole cascade of benefits to customers and just society as general as we're seeing more and more of this electrification.
Yeah, and it's exciting. I think that's the maybe sentiment that you get across the panel here. Electric vehicles are exciting. There's huge prospect to increase demand for renewable power to help level out some of the technological problems that we have, but it's also challenging. Not everyone's in the new car market. I wish I had an electric car, but I'm not in the new car market, and it's a sensitive issue. If you want to open up a can of worms, you can ask people about politics or the car that's sitting in their driveway or the truck that's sitting in their driveway. And so it's going to take a little while to get to a meaningful transition and tipping point with electric vehicles. And that's why, to get to your point earlier about kind of national targets, my organization, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, is more focused on trying to reach, net zero emissions by mid-century, and keeping an all-of-the-above approach to keep as much flexibility as we can, because there are technologies now that can help clean up fossil fuels from an emissions standpoint, take the smokestack and stick it underground, or inject carbon dioxide before the oil even comes out to help make oil and gas net neutral in the long run. Those may not be permanent solutions, but it's part of the bridge and it's part of the conversation that we need to have if we're really going to turn emissions down fast.
Since we're in Iowa, and I grew up on a farm in southwest Iowa, and I live in rural Iowa, there's been a lot of focus on kind of electric truck fleets and on electric vehicles in urban areas. I think there's an opportunity in rural Iowa as well. If you think about the farmers, we've seen previews of electric pickup trucks, and the torque on those is significant. If you think about the range anxiety, range is not as much of an issue for a farmer that's using it, to his farm or run it to town. So I think there's an opportunity there for electric pickup trucks in the rural Iowa market.
Interesting. All right, let me quick pause. Any questions from the audience? If not, we'll keep rolling. All righty, I want to switch for a second back, and maybe it's jumping into the hot end of the fire. Charles, you mentioned politics, and I mentioned earlier that from my perspective, wind energy was bipartisan. Do you all feel that? Do you agree with that? Or how do you think of kind of where we are with renewable energy? Thoughts on the partisan divide or not with wind?
I'd say in Iowa it is, and you kind of referenced Republicans and Democrats. Elected officials from Iowa have seen this as a very bipartisan issue. There's been leadership on both sides of the aisle, and we've benefited from that. I can't speak the same nationally, but certainly here in Iowa, I think that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. In my organization, we work a lot with conservatives and Republicans, and we've seen just tremendous support, whether it be in Texas, which has the highest gross penetration of wind power, or here in Iowa, which is just on par as a percentage. It's something that from a financial sense, it makes sense. That appeals to a certain group of people. From an environmental standpoint, it makes sense, and that appeals to a certain group of people. So I think that because there are so many benefits to wind power, it's really been able to cross that partisan divide in a very important way that I think is really good for those of us that work in the energy industry, because it's something that's easy for folks to get behind.
Yeah, one other thing I would just add to that, we did a poll of our customers, which are, both sides of the aisle supporters, and 91% of our customers said they prefer renewable energy. Now, if you start to ask how much they're willing to pay for it, in addition to what they would have to pay, that support starts to go away. But so it's really incumbent, I think, on the industry to continue to make sure that wind remains and continues to actually drive down electricity prices instead of, pushing them up. But.
Yeah. Justin, do you have a similar sentiment from your customers?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what we're hearing from our customers is renewable energy is a driver. It's what they want, and it has to be a nonpartisan issue. It really does. It's bipartisan. It's nonpartisan, really, because we all turn on the light switch at the end of the day to make sure that everything works, and we all breathe the same air outside. So it really does need to be that nonpartisan issue.
Let's talk about your big customers. I mean, big corporates and industrials. Your sense of, obviously, whether it's Budweiser and other companies that are making commitments to buy renewable, do you see that kind of continuing to take off? Is that a huge market out there, or are they going to be buying a lot of wind energy? What's your all sense of the big companies and what they're doing?
Yeah, they do. They want, whether it's wind or solar, they want renewable energy as well, because their investors are looking at it and saying, what is your carbon footprint overall? And when they get that question, they call us and say, hey, what kind of energy are you bringing us? Because they want to understand what our supply chain looks like, just as they would wanted to understand the supply chain of any of their other vendors and whatnot. And in fact, we're actually now, policy-wise, working with the Utilities Board here in Iowa to advance new ways that we can work with those customers to help bring them new options on how to integrate more renewable energy into their own portfolio.
And I think that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg when it comes to some of those corporate procurements, because people want to be able to tell that story of the communities that they're benefiting through their corporate procurements. Last year, in 2018, I should say, the year has changed. In 2018, 50% of all of the renewables growth for wind and solar were driven by direct corporate power purchase agreements. And I don't know what newspaper you read, but it doesn't matter if it's the local newspaper or the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. Every day it seems like there's another company that's saying by 2030, by 2040, we're going to go 100% renewable or 100% clean. There's going to need to be a lot of investment to get there. And when Larry Fink at BlackRock makes proclamations that suddenly we're going to start examining investments in a big way for climate impacts and sustainability, well, that's going to be a big driver too, as all that money continues to flow in the zero emissions direction, and wind stands to benefit a lot from that.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned, these are projects that take time to build, and these investments are things you need to think about as really long-term investments. And I think these companies are looking at, what are our short and long-term risks related to climate, and not just what makes our customers happy today, but what are we trying to get away from because of the risk it exposes us to over the longer term.
So I'm hearing from y'all, but I want to have you talk about, so how optimistic are you about renewables? They're on a huge growth curve. Are you seeing continued strong trajectory, or are you guys going to start maxing out? What's your sense of kind of how optimistic, how bullish you are on wind and solar and renewables in general?
Yeah, I think that's the way of the future. I mean, our customers, like you've just heard, are that's a customer satisfaction kind of an issue for us. A lot of our large customers, they don't just want low cost energy; they want it to be renewable. Over the last 5 years, we've retired 20% of our coal fleet and grown our wind fleet by 120%. I don't know that we'll continue at that kind of a pace, and there still has to be, reliability has to remain a concern. That's something that customers insist on also. But I definitely think that the way of the future is a more and more renewable grid.
And I want to continue this discussion, but you brought up the reliability, and we alluded to it earlier on intermittency. But you are comfortable with this growth and maintaining reliability of the grid?
Yeah, our reliability isn't any of the worse off for having retired 20% of our coal fleet and grown our wind fleet by 120%. So we did that in 5 years, and it hasn't, we're part of a larger MISO market that's also, adding more wind. It's not just MidAmerican that's doing these things, and you're seeing more baseload generation retire. But yeah, there's been no reliability issue in our service territory associated with the transition.
We've got guys and folks at the company who eat, breathe, and sleep reliability. And how are we going to make sure that whenever our customers need energy, they've got it? Part of it is just the premise of that question when we get it. We're never going to do anything that would keep us from being able to provide energy for our customers. That's what we do. That is our job, is to provide electrons for customers when they need it, where they want it, how they want it. And so we're doing all this studying on the back end to make sure that everything we're doing provides that reliable energy. And now we're able to do it in ways that are cleaner than ever before, lower cost than ever before for some of these options. It is an amazing time, but right now, yeah, reliability, key, number one. You think about it here in Iowa, it used to not be uncommon if you had a 5-day outage in the very rural parts of the state in the worst of the winter. Now, we're hearing from customers who, if it's a 5-second outage, that's too much. Times have changed, and so reliability, number one.
And I think that's maybe a good perspective, is that this is not a transition in the future that we're talking about. In states like Texas and Iowa, across the Midwest, where solar penetration, where wind penetration have been high, there are nerdy engineers that are paying very close attention to figuring out the reliability issue. They've got it solved. And what we've seen is a remarkable transition, even in a place like Iowa here, where there are surpluses of wind power that can be then exported out of state. And if you got a little time, you can check out windpower.com. And it's put together by Climate Central. It's a cool little app, but it tells you on a household basis, what's the percentage of wind power or solar power. And I checked it today before coming here. And today is not an especially windy day, but Iowa today is producing enough wind power to power 250% of the houses in Iowa. Tomorrow, and it's not just because all the politicians will be talking, tomorrow they'll power 450% of the households. So that doesn't make up total energy consumption, but they're interesting graphics. So it puts it in a percentage basis, and I think that helps make it be meaningful to people.
Final comments, Kerry and Dusty, on all of these topics.
Yeah, I'm feeling very optimistic about the momentum behind clean energy right now. If you look at all of the trend lines on the cost of renewable energy, the cost of storage, and the technologies that we need to achieve deep levels of renewable penetration, we are on our way there. The trend lines continue in that direction, and we're seeing an unprecedented economic shift in terms of the cost of renewables compared to coal when it comes to electric generation. So I think we're really witnessing and living through this tipping point in how energy is produced in the U.S., and it's very exciting.
Dusty, you get the last word.
All right. So, reliability is job number one for us, and providing electric service in a reliable manner, a cost-effective manner, is what we're about. We believe modernizing the electric grid, the power grid, is really important, very key to fully utilizing wind energy and the potential that it holds. It also enhances reliability. It reduces congestion on the energy grid so that that energy can flow freely, lowering costs overall. And a key for Iowa and rural Iowa in particular is it also allows additional capacity for growth. And that's something that I know is important to the state, something we're trying to help facilitate is additional economic growth in a lot of those rural counties and communities.
Well, thank you all for this outstanding discussion. I very much enjoyed it. I know we learned a lot. If the audience here can please give a round of applause of genuine thanks to you all for being here.